Miss Marple Murder with the Gardener's Shears. Welcome and thank you for being here with us on Cafe Tales. My name is Ailey, your host, and it's always a joy to see our community gathered together. Tell me, what makes these mysteries special for you? Share in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you can join us for a new story each day. Now let's start tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Market Morning Under Stripes. The Saturday flower market at Much Benham was, Miss Marple often thought, one of the most cheerful sights in the whole of the village calendar. The square, normally rather gray and given over to the parking of motor cars, was transformed into a brilliant patchwork of color and life. Striped awnings in red and white, blue and yellow, green and cream stretched overhead like the sails of some festive flotilla. Beneath them, galvanized buckets brimmed with blooms, roses still tight in bud, peonies heavy as cream puffs, delphiniums the color of summer sky, and great armfuls of lilac that scented the air with their sweetness. It was early May, and the morning sun slanted warmly across the cobbles. Miss Marple, basket over her arm, moved slowly from stall to stall, exchanging pleasantries with the stall holders she had known for years. Saturday mornings at the market were part of the rhythm of village life, as dependable as Sunday morning services at St. Mary Mead. Beside her, Lady Bantry, whom everyone called Dolly, was examining a particularly fine specimen of early roses with the critical eye of one who took her own gardens very seriously indeed. "These are quite lovely. Mrs. Prow," Dolly was saying to the sturdy woman behind stall 5, "you really have outdone yourself this year." Mrs. Lottie Prow, her broad face flushed with pleasure and exertion, nodded vigorously. "It's the mild winter we had, your ladyship. My roses are 3 weeks ahead, and the peonies are just coming into their prime." Miss Marple smiled gently. Mrs. Prow's fingers were stained green from handling stems, and there was a smudge of soil on her weathered cheek. She was, Miss Marple reflected, rather like her flowers, solid, dependable, and thoroughly English. The market hummed with activity. Wedding orders, it seemed, were flying thick and fast. Miss Marple had counted no fewer than 3 young women, each clutching a scrap of paper with careful notes about color schemes and bouquet arrangements. May was, of course, the traditional month for weddings. At stall 7, she could see Harold Bloom directing operations with the brisk efficiency of a military commander. Bloom was a florist wholesaler who had come down from Covent Garden some 5 years previously, bringing with him an air of metropolitan expertise that had rather ruffled local sensibilities at first. He was a lean, energetic man in his mid-50s with sharp eyes and sharper business practices. He held the subleases for half the stalls in the market, which gave him considerable influence over the proceedings. "Morning." "Miss Marple!" Bloom called out, barely glancing up from the order he was examining. "Peggy, where's that list for the Fourskew wedding?" "The girls are coming at 11, and everything needs to be ready." Peggy Marsh, Bloom's assistant, was a quick, neat young woman with nimble fingers that could fashion a bow or twist wire around a stem with equal facility. She darted about the stall like a bright bird, her hands never still. "Right here, Mr. Bloom," she said breathlessly. "Ribbons all cut, and I've set aside the roses you wanted." Miss Marple moved on, pausing to admire a display of cottage garden flowers at stall 9. "The proprietress?" Ivy Nesbit looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ivy was a sharp-featured woman in her early 40s, with an ambitious streak that sometimes manifested itself in ways that were not entirely neighborly. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Ivy said, her voice carrying an edge that might have been intended as pleasant, but emerged as slightly brittle. "Looking for anything particular?" "Just enjoying the sights, Miss Nesbit," Miss Marple replied placidly. "The market is so very pretty on mornings like these." "Pretty enough," Ivy said, and then, lowering her voice, "though some people seem to think they own the place, taking orders that rightfully belong elsewhere, If you understand my meaning. Miss Marple understood perfectly well. The rivalry between Ivy Nesbit and Harold Bloom over wedding work was common knowledge in the village. Only last week there had been some unpleasantness over the Cartwright wedding, with both florists claiming they had been promised the commission. A shadow fell across the stall, and Miss Marple looked up to see Mr. Lionel Keats, the council clerk responsible for collecting stall permits and rents. He was a fussy little man with thinning hair and a perpetual air of self-importance. Under one arm he carried his ubiquitous ledger, and from his waistcoat pocket protruded what appeared to be a small pair of pruning shears. "Miss Nesbit," he said in his precise voice, "I'll need to check your permit, if you please. Just routine, you understand?" He produced the permit from his jacket with a flourish and examined it critically. Miss Marple noticed that the tag was secured with a length of green florist's tape. "This is rather untidy," Keats murmured, more to himself than to Ivy. He drew out his little pruner and snipped the tape neatly, replacing it with a fresh piece from a roll in his bag. There, much more professional. Ivy's expression suggested she had opinions about Keats's interference, but she held her tongue. The council clerk moved on, making his rounds with a vicious precision. Near the center of the square, Miss Marple spotted Tom Yates, the quiet gardener from Gossington Hall. Tom was a tall, spare man with a weathered complexion of one who spent his days out of doors. He was securing the last of the morning's decorations, a garland of greenery that framed the arch at the market's entrance. His long hedging shears lay on the ground beside him, their blades gleaming in the sunlight. "Morning, Tom," Lady Bantry called out. The arch looked splendid. Tom touched his cap. "Thank you, your ladyship. Just tidying up the last bits." His hands moved with the easy competence of long practice, tying a neat bowline to secure the garland in place. The church clock struck the quarter hour, 10:30. The market was reaching its busiest point. Voices called out prices and compliments. Money changed hands, and the scent of flowers hung heavy in the warm air. Miss Marple purchased a small bunch of sweet peas and was turning to join Lady Bantry when she heard raised voices from the direction of stall 7. Harold Bloom's voice carried clearly across the market. "I've had quite enough of this nonsense, Keats." 5 shillings for what?" "Creative accounting. I'll be speaking to the proper authorities. Mark my words." Mr. Keats's reply was lost in the general hubbub, but his face as he hurried away clutching his ledger was flushed an unbecoming shade of red. "Dear me," murmured Lady Bantry. "Someone stirred up trouble." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. She watched as Bloom disappeared behind his stall, presumably to fetch something from the storage crates that were kept in the narrow space behind the row of awnings. The market continued its cheerful bustle. No one paid particular attention to the goings-on behind stall 7. The sun climbed higher. Buckets gleamed. The striped awnings fluttered in the gentle breeze. And then, at 15 minutes before 11, Peggy Marsh's scream split the morning air like a knife. Chapter 2. A Body Behind Stall. The scream seemed to freeze everything for a moment, as though someone had stopped a cinematograph mid-reel. Then, all at once, the market erupted into movement and confused voices. Miss Marple found herself hurrying toward stall 7 with a speed that quite surprised her. Lady Bantry was already ahead, pushing through the small crowd that had begun to gather. Peggy Marsh stood at the edge of the stall, one hand pressed to her mouth, her face chalk white. "Peggy, what is it?" Ivy Nesbit had abandoned her own stall and was gripping the girl's arm. "What's happened?" Peggy could only point with a shaking finger toward the narrow space behind the stall where the storage crates were kept. Inspector Slack arrived at a run from the police house at the far end of the square, his face red with exertion. He was not a man Miss Marple held in particularly high regard, but she had to admit he was prompt in responding to emergencies. "Stand back, all of you," Slack barked. "Give the girl some air." He moved behind the stall, and Miss Marple, positioning herself with the quiet efficiency of long practice, managed to obtain a clear view of the scene. Lady Bantry, who was not easily shocked, drew in her breath sharply. Harold Bloom lay among the empty wooden crates, his body arranged almost neatly, as though he had decided to take a rest in that unlikely spot. But the deep, ugly wound at the side of his neck told a different story altogether. Blood had soaked into his collar and the front of his waistcoat, and a dark stain spread across the wooden planking beneath him. Beside the body, almost as if placed there for dramatic effect, lay Tom Yates's long hedging shears. "The blades were wet with blood. Good God," muttered Slack. He turned to survey the gathering crowd. "Where's Tom Yates? Someone fetch Tom Yates here immediately." Tom appeared from near the entrance arch, his face puzzled. When he saw his shears lying bloodied beside Bloom's body, the color drained from his weathered cheeks. "I never—" he began, but Slack cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't say anything just yet. Tom, we'll have questions for you presently." He glanced around. "Someone sent for Dr. Haydock, I trust?" "I did," said Mrs. Prow, who had materialized at Miss Marple's elbow. "Sent young Tibby running. The doctor was at home," the boy said. Miss Marple's gaze moved methodically over the scene. The narrow space behind stall 7 was cluttered with the usual detritus of market day. Empty crates stacked haphazardly, scraps of twine and cut stems, and a few discarded wrappings. But there were other details that caught her attention. A bucket of water stood upright near Bloom's feet, perfectly still. A single rose head floated on its surface, serene and undisturbed. The rim of the bucket showed no splash marks, no evidence of having been knocked or jostled. The wooden plank beneath it was quite dry. The striped awning that stretched overhead had one corner pulled slightly askew, and the guy rope had been retied. The knot looked hurried, almost careless. Dr. Haydock arrived, black bag in hand, and Slack stepped aside to let him examine the body. The doctor was a brisk, no-nonsense man who had served Much Benham for 30 years. He knelt beside Bloom, conducted his examination with practiced efficiency, and stood up again, brushing dust from his trousers. "Well," Slack demanded. "Dead for perhaps 20 minutes to half an hour," Haydock said. "Single wound to the neck severing the carotid artery. Death would have been rapid." He paused, frowning slightly. "Curious thing, though. The wound is more crushing than slicing. You'd expect a clean cut from shears like those, but this shows considerable blunt force as well." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning whoever wielded those shears put tremendous force behind the blow." "Either that," he trailed off, looking at the wound again. "The mechanics don't quite match the weapon, if I'm being honest. But I'll know more after a proper examination." Slack's jaw tightened. He looked at Tom Yates, who stood silently, his weathered face stricken. "Tom, I'll need you to come down to the station and give a statement." "But I didn't do anything," Tom protested. "I was working on the arch, just there by the entrance. Her ladyship saw me." "That's quite true," Lady Bantry said firmly. Tom was in full view for at least the past half hour. "I watched him tie up the garland." "Nevertheless," Slack said in the tone of a man who had made up his mind and would not be swayed by inconvenient facts, "those are his shears, and that's Bloom's blood on them." Miss Marple moved a little closer, her eyes still scanning the scene. She noticed a bit of twine caught beneath Bloom's shoulder blade, its end showing a clean cut rather than a break. The cash box that normally sat on Bloom's stall table had been pulled down to the ground and lay open near his outstretched hand. Inside it, instead of the day's takings, there were only folded sheets of newspaper. "The money's gone," Peggy said shakily. She had recovered enough to speak, though her voice trembled. "Mr. Bloom had taken nearly £4 already this morning. It should all be in that box." "Robbery, then," Slack said with satisfaction. "Robbery gone wrong?" "Most likely someone tried to steal from the box." Bloom caught them at it. He gestured at the body. "If there was a struggle," Miss Marple said gently, "one might expect more signs of it, Inspector. The bucket hasn't spilled, you see, and the rose floating on the water is quite undisturbed." Slack glanced at her impatiently. "Perhaps the bucket was placed there afterwards." "Miss Marple, perhaps," she agreed mildly, though one does wonder why. Dr. Haydock was examining the wound more closely now, producing a magnifying glass from his bag. "The crushing pattern is quite pronounced," he murmured, almost as if the implement had a flat edge rather than two crossing blades. Before Slack could respond, Nora Pike came bustling through the crowd. Nora was the village busybody, a role she fulfilled with tremendous energy and dedication. She had clearly heard about the murder from some sixth sense that alerted her to any drama within a 5-mile radius. "Is it true?" she demanded breathlessly. "Harold Bloom murdered in broad daylight?" "Now, Nora," Lady Bantry began. But Nora was already peering around Slack's substantial form, trying to catch a glimpse of the body. "With garden shears, they're saying. Poor Tom Yates. Though I always did think it odd the way he kept those shears so sharp." "My late husband always said a man who keeps his tools too sharp." "Thank you, Mrs. Pike," Slack interrupted firmly. "We'll be taking statements from everyone presently. For now, I'd ask you all to return to your stalls and remain available." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, though plenty of backward glances were cast toward stall 7. Miss Marple noticed Mr. Keats hovering at the edge of the gathering, his ledger clutched to his chest, his face pale. When he caught her looking at him, he turned quickly away and scurried off toward the council offices at the edge of the square. Miss Marple bent down, apparently to adjust her shoe, and studied the wooden plank beneath the bucket more closely. The surface was dusty, as one would expect, but there was a narrow trace where something had been dragged across it, disturbing the fine layer of grime. The mark led from where the body now lay toward the pile of crates. She straightened up slowly, her keen mind already beginning to work on the problem. Lady Bantry appeared at her side, speaking in a low voice. "What do you think, Jane?" Miss Marple looked at the bucket, at the undisturbed rose, at the hastily retied awning guy, and at the cut end of twine beneath the dead man's shoulder. "I think, Dolly," she said quietly, "that someone has arranged this scene with considerable care. Mr. Bloom was not killed here. He was brought here and settled as tidily as a display of flowers." Lady Bantry stared at her. "But why on earth would anyone do that?" Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful behind her spectacles. "To make it appear that someone else did it. My dear, to frame poor Tom Yates, who is exactly the sort of honest, straightforward man who would never think to defend himself properly against such an accusation." She glanced once more at the bloodied shears, at the bucket that had never spilled, at all the small details that told a story quite different from the obvious one. "No," she said softly. "This was carefully planned, and the person who planned it made only one mistake. They were too clever by half." Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a dry bucket. The police photographer had arrived and was setting up his equipment with the sort of deliberate fussiness that suggested he relished his importance in the proceedings. Inspector Slack stood guard over the scene, preventing anyone from approaching too closely, though he seemed willing enough to let Dr. Haydock continue his examination. Miss Marple had withdrawn to a tactful distance, settling herself on a wooden bench near Mrs. Prowse's stall. From this vantage point, she had an excellent view of the comings and goings, and people seemed quite happy to drift over and share their thoughts with her. It was remarkable, she reflected, how witnesses would say things to a harmless elderly lady that they would never dream of mentioning to the police. Lady Bantry sat beside her, fanning herself with a market program. The morning had grown quite warm, and the excitement had left her rather flushed. "I simply cannot believe it," Dolly said for perhaps the third time. "Harold Bloom, Murdered right here in the market, and poor Tom Yates being suspected. It's absolutely absurd, Jane. Tom wouldn't harm a fly. The steadiest people rarely would, Miss Marple agreed, which is precisely why they make such convenient suspects when something of this nature occurs. Peggy Marsh had been given a cup of sweet tea and was sitting on an upturned crate, still looking shaken. Mrs. Prow hovered near her, maternal and concerned. Miss Marple rose and approached them with gentle steps. "My dear," she said to Peggy, "what a terrible shock for you." "You found him, I understand." Peggy nodded, clutching her teacup with both hands. "I went round back to fetch more rose wire. We'd run short at the front, and Mr. Bloom had a whole box of it stored with the empty crates. That's when I saw him lying there, and the blood, and those shears." Her voice broke slightly, and Mrs. Prow patted her shoulder. There, child. No need to dwell on it. Did you notice anything unusual before that?" Miss Marple asked. "Anyone behaving strangely or going near the back of the stall?" Peggy frowned, thinking. Well, Mr. Keats was round earlier checking the permits. He and Mr. Bloom had words, but they often did. Mr. Bloom didn't care for the way Mr. Keats managed the fees. "Words about what exactly?" "The rent, I think. Mr. Bloom said something about 5 shillings going to the newspapers if things weren't put right. He was quite sharp about it. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. And Tom Yates? Did you see him this morning?" "Oh, yes. He was working on the entrance arch. Nowhere near our stall, though. He'd lent Mr. Bloom his shears yesterday to trim some overgrown hedging at the back of the market area. Mr. Bloom was supposed to return them this morning, but I don't think he had yet." This was interesting indeed. Miss Marple thanked Peggy and returned to her bench. Where Lady Bantry was now engaged in conversation with Ivy, Nesbit Ivy's sharp features were animated with a mixture of distress and something that might have been satisfaction. "I'm not saying I wished him harm," Ivy was declaring, "but Harold Bloom was not an honest tradesman. He stole the Cartwright wedding order right out from under me. Told Mrs. Cartwright that my roses weren't fresh when they were cut that very morning. It was pure spite, nothing else." "Still," Lady Bantry said mildly, "that's hardly a reason for murder." "Of course not. I'm simply saying that Harold Bloom made enemies. I'm not the only one who had grievances." After Ivy had swept back to her own stall, Lady Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple. She sounds almost pleased about it all. "Grievances are curious things," Miss Marple observed. "They can fester for years without leading to violence, and then quite suddenly something snaps. Though in this case..." She paused, gazing toward stall 7. "In this case, I don't believe anything snapped at all. This was calculated, Dolly, carefully planned and executed. But the shears, Jane, Tom's shears, lying right there with blood on them. Exactly. Right there. Plain as day. Almost too plain, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple stood up with decision. "Come along, Dolly. I want to have another look at that bucket." Inspector Slack was not pleased to see them approach, but Dr. Haydock intervened on their behalf. "Let Miss Marple have a look, Inspector. She's got an eye for detail." "I'll grant her that," Slack harumphed but stepped aside grudgingly. "Don't touch anything, mind you." Miss Marple had no intention of touching anything. She simply wanted to observe. She moved to where the bucket stood, that serene, undisturbed bucket with its floating rose head. "Now," she said, more to herself than to the others, "if there had been a genuine struggle, if Mr. Bloom had been attacked here where he fell, what would we expect?" "Blood spatter," Dr. Haydock said promptly. "Movement, signs of defense. Precisely. And this bucket full of water standing at the victim's feet, in any sort of violent encounter, it would surely have been knocked over. Water would have splashed. The rose would have tumbled out. Yet here it sits, perfectly calm." She bent down, careful not to let her skirts brush anything, and examined the wooden plank beneath the bucket. Her eyesight was not what it once was, but it was still sharp enough for this purpose. "The plank is dry," she announced. "Not merely where the bucket stands now, but all around it. There's dust here, you see, quite undisturbed, except for this one narrow mark." She indicated the drag trace she had noticed earlier. Something was moved across this surface after the dust had settled. "A crate, perhaps." Slack frowned down at the mark. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I am suggesting that this bucket was placed here deliberately after Mr. Bloom was already dead, placed carefully by someone who wanted to create the, impression of a scene that never actually occurred." She straightened up and moved to examine the awning guy that held up the striped canvas overhead. The rope had clearly been retied recently, the knot still showing the brightness of fresh hemp against the weathered portion. "This knot," she said, beckoning Lady Bantry closer. "Does it look like Tom Yates's work to you, Dolly?" Lady Bantry studied it. "Not really. Tom's knots are always so neat." "This looks rather hurried," Miss Marple added, "and tied left-handed. See how the working end comes from the left side. Tom Yates is right-handed and is not shy about it. I've watched him tie up climbing roses on your terrace wall, Dolly. He uses a bowline, always neat, always right-handed." "So someone else tied this," Slack said slowly. He was beginning to pay closer attention now, his initial skepticism fading. "Someone who wanted to make it appear that there had been a struggle," Miss Marple confirmed. "Someone who retied this guy rope in haste and didn't stop to think about the habits of the man they were attempting to implicate." She moved once more, crouching with some difficulty, to peer at the bit of twine trapped beneath Bloom's shoulder. The end had been cut cleanly, not snapped or torn as it would be in a struggle. This twine, too, tells a story. The cut is clean, made with a sharp blade. But look closely at the face of the cut. It's not angled as one would expect from scissoring blades. It's been crushed slightly flat. Dr. Haydock joined her, pulling out his magnifying glass again. "By Jove, you're right. That's not the mark of a regular shears at all." Miss Marple dusted off her hands. She looked at the scene as a whole. The neat arrangement, the dry bucket with its floating rose, the hastily tied knot, the crushed cut in the twine. "Mr. Bloom was killed elsewhere," she said with quiet certainty. "Then his body was brought here and arranged to look as though he'd been attacked during a robbery. The bucket was placed at his feet to suggest he'd been standing by it when struck down. The awning was retied to suggest a struggle, and Tom Yates's shears were brought here and stained with blood to direct suspicion toward an innocent man." "But who would do such a thing?" Lady Bantry asked. "And why?" Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful behind her spectacles. "Someone who needed a scapegoat, my dear. Someone who knew that Tom's shears were available, who had access to this area, and who could move about without exciting suspicion." She paused. Someone, in fact, who was already present at the market this morning, going about their usual business. Inspector Slack's expression had shifted from skepticism to uncomfortable consideration. "You're saying it's someone here? One of the regular stallholders or someone else who had legitimate reason to be here?" "The question we must ask ourselves," Miss Marple said gently, "is not who might have wanted Mr. Bloom dead, though that matters too. The question is, who would have the opportunity, the knowledge, and the presence of mind to stage such an elaborate deception?" She looked once more at the bloodied shears lying beside the body. And who would benefit most from having Tom Yates arrested for murder? Chapter 4. Bypass versus Anvil. By noon, the market square had taken on an oddly subdued quality. The remaining stallholders spoke in hushed voices, and customers who arrived late, unaware of the morning's tragedy, sensed immediately that something was amiss. The striped awnings that had seemed so festive earlier now cast shadows that felt almost ominous. Miss Marple had accepted Lady Bantry's invitation to take luncheon at Gossington Hall. But before leaving the square, she had one more matter to attend to. She approached Inspector Slack, who was directing 2 constables in their search of the area around stall 7. "Inspector," she said in her most diffident manner, "I wonder if I might impose upon you for a small favor." Slack looked wary, as he always did when Miss Marple made requests. Experience had taught him that her favors often led to uncomfortable revelations. "What sort of favor, Miss Marple?" "I should very much like to examine the various cutting implements used by the stallholders, the shears and secateurs, you understand. It would be most instructive." "I don't see what difference it makes," Slack began. But Dr. Haydock, who had been listening, interrupted. "Actually, Inspector, I think Miss Marple may be onto something. That wound bothered me from the start. The mechanics of it, as I said." Slack sighed. "Very well, but make it quick. I've got statements to take." Within a quarter of an hour, Miss Marple had assembled quite a collection on one of the market tables. Tom Yates's long hedging shears, now carefully wrapped to preserve the bloodstains, lay to one side. Beside them were Ivy Nesbitt's stem cutters, Mrs. Prow's pruning shears, and a small pair of secateurs that Mr. Keats, after some reluctance, had produced from his jacket pocket. "Now then," Miss Marple said, adjusting her spectacles, "let us consider the nature of cutting implements." She picked up a discarded flower stem and held it delicately. "Tom's hedging shears, which we must examine despite their current state, are what is known as bypass shears. The 2 blades pass by each other rather like scissors. They create a clean, angled cut with very little crushing. She demonstrated with Mrs. Prow's pruning shears, which operated on the same principle, snipping through the stem cleanly. The cut end showed a neat diagonal slice. Now observe the difference." She picked up Ivy's cheaper secateurs. "These are anvil-type cutters. One sharpened blade comes down onto a flat surface, rather like a knife onto a cutting board. The action creates more of a crushing force." She made another cut. This time the stem end showed not only the slice, but a slight flattening where the blade had pressed it against the anvil surface. "The distinction may seem trivial," Miss Marple continued, "but when one considers the wound that killed Mr. Bloom, it becomes rather significant." Dr. Haydock was nodding vigorously. "That's precisely what troubled me. The wound showed that crushing characteristic, that flat compression, not the clean V-cut you'd expect from bypass shears." "But Tom's shears are covered in Bloom's blood," Slack protested. "How do you explain that?" "I don't explain it, Inspector. I merely observe that the blood may have been applied after the fact." Miss Marple turned her attention to the bloodied shears, studying them without touching. "And there's something else rather curious here." She pointed to a faint discoloration visible beneath the dried blood on one blade. "That greenish smear. Unless I'm very much mistaken, that's florist's tape residue. The tape is coated with a sticky substance that leaves quite a distinctive mark." Peggy Marsh, who had been hovering nearby, spoke up timidly. "Tom didn't handle any tape this morning, Miss Marple. I'm certain of it. He was only working with the greenery for the arch, nothing that needed binding." "Exactly." Miss Marple turned to examine Mr. Keats's small pruner more closely. It was a neat little implement, well maintained, with an anvil-cutting surface. "Mr. Keats, you use your pruner for trimming permit tags, I believe?" Keats shifted uncomfortably, among other things. "Yes, it's convenient to carry, and the tags are secured with florist's tape sometimes when they need to be attached properly." Miss Marple picked up another discarded stem and asked Keats to demonstrate his pruner's action. He cut through the stem with a quick snip. The resulting end showed not only the characteristic flat crush of an anvil cut, but also, Miss Marple noticed with great interest, a tiny additional mark at one edge. "Your anvil has a small nick in it," she observed. "Just there at the corner. It leaves quite a distinctive signature on whatever you cut." Keats examined his pruner as though seeing it for the first time. "I suppose it does. Never paid it much attention." Lady Bantry had joined the group and was following the discussion with keen interest. "Jane, what are you suggesting?" I am suggesting that we have been presented with a weapon that could not possibly have caused the wound we observe. Tom's bypass shears would leave an entirely different mark. The wound Dr. Haydock described, with its crushing force and flat compression, could only have been made by an anvil-type implement. She let this sink in before continuing. Furthermore, the blood on Tom's shears sits atop a layer of florist's tape residue, suggesting the tape was there first and the blood applied afterwards. The sequence is most revealing. Inspector Slack was looking decidedly uncomfortable now. Are you saying someone deliberately bloodied Tom's shears to frame him? I am saying exactly that, Inspector, but who? And which anvil-type tool was actually used? Those, Miss Marple said gently, are indeed the pertinent questions. She moved to examine Ivy Nesbit's anvil secateurs more closely. They were cheap and rather blunt, showing signs of heavy use. When she inspected the cutting edge, however, there was no nick. No distinctive marking that might serve as a signature. Miss Nesbit, she said, your secateurs are quite clean, are they not? Ivy bristled. Of course they're clean. I keep my tools properly. I meant, Miss Marple clarified gently, that they show no unusual marks or imperfections that might identify a cut made by them. She returned her attention to Mr. Keats's pruner. The little nick in the anvil surface was quite clear now that one knew to look for it. It would leave a telltale mark on anything it cut. Inspector, she said, I believe we should examine Mr. Bloom's stall permit tag rather carefully. The string appears to have been cut, not torn or broken. If we were to look at the cut end with Dr. Haydock's magnifying glass, I suspect we might find something most interesting. The permit tag was retrieved from where it dangled at stall 7. The string had indeed been cut cleanly through, and when Dr. Haydock applied his magnifying glass to the severed end, he let out a low whistle. There's a nick in the cut face, he announced. A small one, but quite distinctive, and the cut itself shows that flat, crushed character of an anvil blade. All eyes turned to Mr. Keats, who had gone very pale indeed. Now, Inspector, Miss Marple said in her mild conversational tone, we must ask ourselves, why would someone cut Mr. Bloom's permit string? And why would they use an anvil-type pruner with a distinctive nick in its cutting surface? Keats found his voice, though it came out rather higher than usual. That doesn't prove anything. Anyone could have cut that string for any number of reasons. Indeed they could, Miss Marple agreed. But when we add this fact to all the others, a pattern begins to emerge. Don't you think so, Inspector? Slack's face had taken on a grim cast. I think, Mr. Keats, that you and I need to have a very serious conversation down at the station, and I'll be keeping that pruner of yours as evidence. As two constables moved to escort the protesting clerk away, Miss Marple gathered up her basket and prepared to leave with Lady Bantry. The puzzle was not yet complete, but several pieces had fallen satisfyingly into place. Tools do tell tales, she murmured to Dolly as they walked toward the motor car. One simply needs to know how to listen to them. Chapter 5. The Permit Tag with a Wrong Cut. Luncheon at Gossington Hall was a somewhat distracted affair. Lady Bantry's cook had prepared a lovely cold salmon, but neither lady did it full justice. Miss Marple ate sparingly, her mind clearly occupied with the morning's events, while Dolly kept interrupting herself mid-sentence to pose new questions. But Jane, if Mr. Keats did kill Harold Bloom, why on earth would he cut the permit string? What possible purpose could that serve? Miss Marple dabbed at her lips with her napkin. That is indeed the question, my dear. Nothing in a murder of this type is done without purpose. Every action serves the larger plan. Perhaps he needed to remove the permit tag for some reason. Perhaps, though the tag was still there, merely detached. No, I think the cutting of that string tells us something rather different. She paused, considering. May I use your telephone, Dolly? I should like to speak with Nora Pike. Lady Bantry raised her eyebrows but led the way to the hall telephone. Within moments, Miss Marple had Nora on the line and was asking her, in the most casual possible manner, whether she had happened to observe Mr. Keats's activities that morning in any detail. Nora, as might be expected, had observed a great deal. Her account, delivered in breathless and somewhat rambling fashion, confirmed that Keats had been making his usual rounds, checking permits and collecting rents. He had stopped at several stalls, including Mrs. Prow's, where he had indeed trimmed a permit tag that he deemed untidy. Most helpful. "Thank you, Nora," Miss Marple said, and rang off before Mrs. Pike could launch into speculation about the murder itself. "Mrs. Prow mentioned that as well," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, returning to the dining room. "Mr. Keats has a habit of tidying things, it seems, cutting tags, adjusting permits, making everything neat and official. But surely that's just his fussy nature. Undoubtedly. But it also provides excellent cover for using his pruner freely around the market. No one would think twice about seeing him snip this or trim that. It's part of his regular behavior." They had moved to the drawing room for coffee when Tom Yates himself appeared, having been released from the police station. He looked exhausted and deeply shaken, but there was relief in his weathered face. "Begging your pardon, your ladyship, Miss Marple, but Inspector Slack said I should thank you both. He said if Miss Marple hadn't noticed about the cuts and the tools, I might still be under suspicion." "Nonsense, Tom," Lady Bantry said warmly. "Anyone who knows you would know you could never do such a thing." "That's kind of you to say, ma'am, but the inspector was powerful sure those were my shears with Bloom's blood on them." "Hard to argue with that." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. "Tom, I wonder if you might help me understand something. You lent your shears to Mr. Bloom, is that correct?" "Yesterday afternoon?" "Yes. He wanted to trim back some brambles that were growing over the back wall of the market area. Said it looked untidy for when the council inspector came round. I left them with him when I finished work." "And when did you expect to get them back?" "This morning first thing. But when I arrived at the market, Mr. Bloom was already busy setting up his stall, so I thought I'd collect them later." "Never got the chance, as it turned out." "So your shears were accessible to anyone who knew where Mr. Bloom had put them?" Tom frowned. "I suppose so. He'd left them propped behind his stall with the rest of his equipment. Anyone at the market might have seen them there." This was illuminating. Miss Marple thanked Tom and assured him that his assistance had been invaluable. After he departed, she sat quietly for a moment, her fingers steepled in that characteristic gesture that Lady Bantry knew meant serious thought was in progress. "The permit string," Miss Marple said at last. "I believe I understand it now, Dolly. It wasn't about the tag itself. It was about establishing a pattern, a reason for having used his pruner near Mr. Bloom's stall." "You've lost me entirely. Jane, consider. Mr. Keats kills Mr. Bloom with his distinctive anvil pruner. In doing so, he leaves that telltale nick mark somewhere, perhaps on something he didn't anticipate. Rather than risk that mark being noticed and traced back to his tool, he creates a perfectly innocent reason for his pruner to have been used near Bloom's stall. He cuts the permit string openly and without suspicion, because that's the sort of fussy thing he always does." Lady Bantry's eyes widened. "So if anyone noticed the nick mark on the string, they would think nothing of it because everyone knew Keats had been trimming tags that morning." "Precisely. It's rather like a painter who accidentally splashes red paint on his trousers and then deliberately paints a red fence while wearing those same trousers. If anyone asks about the paint, he can say perfectly truthfully that he got it while painting the fence." Good heavens. But Jane, if he was so careful about the permit string, why would he leave other evidence behind? "Because, my dear Dolly, even the cleverest murderer cannot think of everything. They may plan meticulously for certain contingencies while overlooking others entirely." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. In this case, I suspect Mr. Keats knew his pruner left a distinctive mark and took steps to explain that mark's presence. What he failed to consider was that the type of cut itself would reveal the deception. She rose and moved to the window, looking out over the well-tended gardens. He thought that by staging the scene carefully and framing Tom Yates, he could direct all suspicion away from himself. The bypass versus anvil distinction simply didn't occur to him as something anyone would notice. But you noticed only because Dr. Haydock remarked upon the crushing nature of the wound. That set me thinking about the mechanics of cutting tools. And once one begins to notice such things, other details fall into place. Lady Bantry poured fresh coffee. What I still don't understand is the motive. Why would Mr. Keats kill Harold Bloom over a disagreement about fees? It seems such a trivial cause for murder. Murder is very rarely committed for adequate cause in the rational sense, Miss Marple observed. Small men with small powers can feel tremendously threatened when those powers are challenged. If Mr. Keats was indeed collecting improper fees, the threat of exposure to the newspapers would mean not merely embarrassment, but the loss of his position, possibly criminal charges, certainly public shame, all over 5 shillings. All over 5 shillings. Repeated across how many stalls? How many market days? The amounts might add up to something quite substantial. But more than that, it would be the exposure itself, the knowledge that everyone would know he was a petty thief, that his careful respectability was a sham. She turned from the window. Pride, Dolly, and the fear of losing face. They have motivated more murders than simple greed ever has. The telephone rang and Lady Bantry went to answer it. When she returned, her face was animated with news. That was Inspector Slack. He's been going through Mr. Keats's records, and they found significant discrepancies. It appears Keats has been collecting extra fees from the stallholders for months, perhaps longer, and pocketing the difference. The amounts are quite considerable in total, and Harold Bloom discovered this, apparently. So Peggy remembered that Bloom had been checking his receipts against what he'd actually paid and found they didn't match. He'd confronted Keats about it this very morning before the market opened. Miss Marple nodded slowly. There you see. The motive becomes clearer. Not 5 shillings, but systematic theft and the imminent exposure of that theft. Mr. Bloom threatened to go to the newspapers, which would have ruined Mr. Keats entirely. So Keats killed him. Quickly and with whatever implement he had to hand, which happened to be his own pruner. Then he staged the scene to implicate Tom Yates, using the convenient presence of Tom Shears to build his frame. Lady Bantry shivered slightly despite the warmth of the afternoon. How calculating it all sounds when you lay it out like that. Murder is calculating, my dear, Miss Marple said quietly. Even murders done in sudden passion have a cold logic to their aftermath. Mr. Keats may have struck in a moment of panic, but what he did afterwards was entirely deliberate. He moved the body, arranged the scene, bloodied the shears, created his little tableau, all of it designed to protect himself and destroy an innocent man. She picked up her handbag, preparing to depart. Fortunately, he made several mistakes. The cuts told their own story, and tools, as I mentioned earlier, do have their signatures. One simply needs to know how to read them. Chapter 6. 2 receipts, 1 stall. The following morning brought rain, which seemed appropriate for the general mood of Much Benham. The market was closed naturally, and the square looked forlorn, with its empty cobblestones gleaming wetly under gray skies. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let inclement weather prevent useful activity. She had invited Nora Pike to tea, a prospect that filled Mrs. Pike with tremendous excitement and a conviction that she was about to be made privy to important confidences. She was not entirely wrong. Nora arrived promptly at 4 o'clock. Shaking out her umbrella in Miss Marple's small hallway and settling herself in the best chair with an air of eager anticipation. Miss Marple poured tea and offered cake, and for several minutes the conversation revolved around village matters of no particular consequence. Then, with the casual air of one making idle conversation, Miss Marple remarked, "I understand you were examining Mr. Keats's ledger yesterday morning." Nora, such a tragic coincidence that you happened to be looking at it just when all that dreadful business occurred. Nora needed no further encouragement. Oh, Miss Marple, it was the strangest thing. I'd gone to pay my subscription for the church fete stall, you see, and Mr. Keats had his ledger open right there on Mrs. Prow's table while he was checking her permit. I couldn't help but notice, purely by accident, of course, that there seemed to be 2 entries for stall 7. 2 entries? How curious. That's exactly what I thought. Both dated for yesterday morning, both for Harold Bloom, but written quite differently. The first was in Mr. Keats's usual neat hand, recording the regular rent, but the second, made perhaps an hour later, was slower, more labored somehow, and it said something like H. Bloom, cash adjustment, with the amount written beside it. Miss Marple refilled Nora's teacup thoughtfully. And did you mention this to Mr. Keats? I did, actually. I asked him about it, just making conversation, you understand? He seemed rather flustered and said something about Mr. Bloom regularizing a sub-rent arrangement. He closed the ledger rather quickly after that. I see. And this second entry, how much was it for? Nora's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of having pertinent information. 5 shillings exactly. I remember because I thought it odd. Such a small amount to warrant a separate entry. After Nora had departed, well satisfied with her importance to the investigation, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting. The pattern was becoming clearer with each new thread of information. 2 receipts for 1 stall, with the second appearing after what Peggy had described as a heated confrontation. That second entry, made in a different, more careful hand, suggested something hastily fabricated to cover irregularities. The rain continued through the evening, and Miss Marple retired early with a volume of Trollope, but her mind was not on the ecclesiastical politics of Barchester. She was thinking about ledgers and receipts, about the careful falsifications of small men with large fears. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the rain had washed away more than just the dust from the cobblestones. Inspector Slack called upon Miss Marple mid-morning, his expression a mixture of grudging respect and professional frustration. "You were right about those receipts," he said without preamble, accepting the chair Miss Marple offered. Keats had been running a neat little scheme. He'd collect the proper rents, record them in his official ledger, but then charge extra fees for various services that didn't actually exist. He'd pocket the difference, and most stallholders never thought to question it. But Mr. Bloom did question it. Exactly. Bloom kept his own careful records, being a businessman from London. He noticed the discrepancies and confronted Keats about them on Saturday morning before the market properly opened. We've got Peggy Marsh's testimony about overhearing part of that conversation. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. And what did Mr. Bloom say precisely? Slack consulted his notebook. According to Peggy, Bloom said the extra 5 shillings would go to the papers if things weren't put right. She didn't understand what he meant at the time, thought it was just about the money itself. But clearly Bloom was threatening to expose Keats's entire scheme to the local newspaper, which would have destroyed Mr. Keats's reputation and livelihood completely. The council would have dismissed him immediately, and there'd likely be criminal charges. For a man like Keats, who trades on his official position and his respectability, it would be absolute ruin. So he made that second entry in his ledger, Miss Marple said softly. After he'd killed Mr. Bloom, he created a false receipt to show that the dispute had been settled amicably, a cash adjustment, regularizing accounts. If anyone looked at his records, they would see that whatever disagreement there had been was resolved. That's our thinking as well. He was trying to eliminate any motive that might point to him. Slack shook his head. The audacity of it, Miss Marple. Killing a man and then calmly writing a false entry in his ledger to cover it up. Not so much audacity as necessity, I think. Once the decision to murder was made, every subsequent action had to support the fiction of innocence. She paused. Have you spoken to the other stallholders about their payments? We have. Mrs. Prow admitted she'd been paying an extra 2 shillings per market day for what Keats called a priority placement fee. She thought it was legitimate, part of the official charges. Ivy Nesbit had been paying an extra 3 shillings for something Keats described as a peak trading hours surcharge. Same with several others. All these little additions that went straight into Keats's pocket. Substantial amounts over time, indeed. We estimate he'd taken nearly £50 over the past year alone. For a council clerk on his salary, that's a significant supplement. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And when Mr. Bloom threatened to expose it all, Mr. Keats saw not merely the loss of that extra income, but the complete destruction of everything he had built. His position, his reputation, his standing in the community. He's confessed to the financial irregularities, Slack said. Claims he was only trying to make ends meet, that his salary wasn't sufficient, but he's still denying the murder. Insists he had nothing to do with Bloom's death, despite all the evidence pointing his way. The evidence of the cuts, the distinctive nick in his pruner, that and more. We found the newspaper he'd stuffed in Bloom's cash box matches sheets from a bundle in Keats's own office. The green florist tape on his cuff links him to the scene, and we've got a witness who heard a scraping sound behind stall 7 at precisely the time Keats says he was elsewhere. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. A scraping sound? Young Tibby Clark, the boy who runs errands at the market, he heard what he described as a crate being shoved, and then a bucket clink, right around 20 minutes before 11. That matches the timing of when Keats would have been staging the scene. The crate being moved to make space, Miss Marple murmured, creating that drag mark I noticed on the plank. And the bucket being set down carefully, so carefully that not a drop spilled. Slack stood to leave. I don't mind telling you, Miss Marple, without your observations about those cuts and the tools, we might have charged Tom Yates. The evidence against him looked damning on the surface. Surface evidence often does, Inspector. That's rather the point of staging a scene so elaborately, but surfaces can be misleading, while small details, properly observed, tend toward truth. After Slack had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind continued working through the accumulating evidence. 2 receipts where there should have been 1, a false entry to conceal motive. Systematic theft dressed up as official fees, and underlying it all, the desperate panic of a small man facing exposure. She thought of Mr. Keats with his fussy manner and his little ledger, his pruner always ready to trim and tidy things. How appropriate, in a grim way, that his own tool for imposing order had become the instrument of murder. The afternoon sun slanted through her window, warming the room. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of village life continuing. The world moved on as it always did, while she sat quietly piecing together the final elements of the puzzle. Chapter 7. Green tape on a clerk's cuff. Miss Marple had always held the view that physical evidence, while valuable, was most effective when combined with careful observation of human behavior. It was one thing to note a smear of green tape on a jacket cuff. Quite another to understand what that smear revealed about the actions and state of mind of the person wearing the jacket. She was contemplating this principle on Wednesday afternoon when Lady Bantry arrived with fresh intelligence from Inspector Slack. The police had been conducting a thorough examination of Mr. Keats's clothing and possessions, and the results were proving most illuminating. They found traces of that green florist tape all over his jacket, Dolly reported, settling herself on Miss Marple's sofa with evident satisfaction. Not just on the cuff, but on the sleeves and even on his waistcoat. Slack says it's the same type used throughout the market for securing permit tags. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. Though, of course, Mr. Keats handles those tags regularly as part of his duties. One might expect some transfer of the tape residue in the normal course of things. That's what Keats is claiming. But there's more, Jane. They found a dark stain on his sleeve, circular in shape, that matches exactly the rim of those galvanized buckets the stall holders use. Dr. Haydock examined it under his microscope and says it's consistent with metal. Corrosion mixed with water. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft click. A bucket rim mark. How very careless of Mr. Keats. Slack thinks it shows Keats carried the bucket to the scene to make it look as though there had been a struggle by the water. More than that, Dolly, it shows he carried it carefully, holding it against his body to avoid spilling. An innocent person moving a bucket would simply carry it by the handle, but someone staging a scene would need to transport a full bucket without sloshing water everywhere, which would rather spoil the effect of a bucket that supposedly stood undisturbed during a violent encounter. Lady Bantry considered this, so he tucked it against himself as he carried it. Precisely, and in doing so, left that telltale ring on his sleeve. Miss Marple's eyes held that distant look that meant she was assembling pieces in her mind. What else did the police find? Newspaper in his office bag matching the sheet stuffed in Bloom's cash box, same typeface, same edition of the Much Benham Gazette. Keats says it's just coincidence that everyone has old newspapers lying about. A weak defense. Very weak. And there's something else that struck me as peculiar. When the police questioned him about his movements that morning, he claimed he'd merely been going about his usual rounds, collecting fees and checking permits. But Ivy Nesbit gave them a different story entirely. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. What did Miss Nesbit say? That Tom Yates had borrowed her anvil secateurs earlier that morning to cut some wire for the entrance arch. She was quite adamant about it. Said she'd seen Tom using them, but Tom denies it flatly. Says he only used his own bypass shears for the greenery work. How very curious that Miss Nesbit would make such a claim. Slack thinks she's simply mistaken, or perhaps trying to muddy the waters because of her own grudge against Bloom. But I wondered if there might be more to it. Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, where she kept a small notebook for recording observations. She consulted it briefly before returning to her seat. When I examined Miss Nesbit's anvil secateurs on Saturday, she said slowly, I noticed they were wet and smelled distinctly of the moss trough, where flower stems are kept soaking. At the time, I thought it merely indicated she'd been working with flowers. But now I wonder if there wasn't something more significant about those wet secateurs. What do you mean? I mean, my dear, that someone might have used Miss Nesbit's anvil tool and then returned it to her stall, possibly hiding it temporarily in the moss trough to wash away any evidence. Miss Nesbit, finding her tool wet and displaced, might have assumed Tom had borrowed it, especially if she had some reason to want to cast suspicion on him or away from someone else. Lady Bantry's eyes widened. You think Keats used Ivy's tool to commit the murder? No, I don't believe so. The wound characteristics match a smaller implement, more like Keats's pocket pruner than Ivy's heavier secateur. But the wet tool in the moss trough does suggest something was deliberately concealed there. She paused. I think we need to return to the market, Dolly. There's an element to this puzzle that we haven't yet uncovered. An hour later, they stood once more in the empty market square. The stalls had been taken down, but the basic structures remained. Miss Marple made her way directly to where the moss trough had been positioned, a long wooden box used for soaking cut stems to keep them fresh. The police examined this naturally, Lady Bantry said, but they found nothing except wet moss and stem cuttings. Did they drain it completely? I wonder. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty, peering into the trough's depths. The water had been partially emptied, but not entirely removed. She felt carefully along the bottom with a stick she'd brought for the purpose. After several minutes, her efforts were rewarded. The stick caught on something metallic. Using the stick as a lever, she carefully brought the object to the surface. It was a small anvil pruner, similar in size to Mr. Keats's pocket implement, but clearly distinct from it. The metal was darkened from its time in the water, but the distinctive nick in the anvil surface was plainly visible. Good heavens, Lady Bantry breathed. Another pruner. The murder weapon, unless I'm very much mistaken, Miss Marple said, examining it carefully without touching it directly. See that nick? It matches exactly the mark on the permit string. This is the tool that actually killed Mr. Bloom, and Keats hid it here after staging the scene with Tom's bloodied Shears. But why hide it at all? Why not simply dispose of it somewhere far from the market? Because Dolly? He needed to produce a pruner when attention turned to cutting implements. He couldn't very well claim not to own one when everyone had seen him trimming permit tags all morning. So he hid the murder weapon and carried a spare, an identical but unused tool, to show the police if necessary. Lady Bantry stared at the darkened pruner. How coldly calculating, extremely so. But even cold calculation has its limits. He didn't anticipate that anyone would examine the wound closely enough to distinguish between bypass and anvil cuts. He didn't expect anyone to notice the distinctive nick his pruner left, and he certainly didn't imagine someone would find the actual weapon he'd hidden. Miss Marple straightened up, her expression grave. We must inform Inspector Slack immediately. This pruner will need to be properly examined, but I believe it will show traces of Mr. Bloom's blood beneath the surface corrosion, and when compared directly with the wound, it will prove to be an exact match. As they walked back toward the police station, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence. The green tape on Keats's cuff and fingers, the bucket rim mark on his sleeve, the hidden weapon in the moss trough, all of it pointing to a carefully orchestrated deception that was now unraveling thread by thread. The great difficulty with staging an elaborate scene, she observed to Lady Bantry, is that each element of the staging leaves its own trail of evidence. Mr. Keats was so focused on framing Tom Yates that he failed to consider what traces he himself was leaving behind. The tape from handling permits, the water stain from carrying the bucket, the hidden pruner that seemed so clever at the time but is now perhaps the most damning evidence of all. Tools have signatures, you said before. Indeed, they do. And people in their way have signatures too, their habits, their choices, their small mistakes. One simply needs to learn how to read them properly. Chapter 8. Alibis between 10 and 11. Inspector Slack had convened what he termed an informal gathering at the police station on Thursday morning. All the principal figures from the market were present. Ivy Nesbit, looking defensive and sharp-eyed. Mrs. Prow, solid and uncomfortable in her Sunday dress. Peggy Marsh, still pale but composed. Tom Yates, quietly dignified. And young Tibby Clark, the errand boy, who fidgeted on his chair with barely contained excitement at his importance. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry had been invited to attend, a concession Slack would not have made a few years earlier, but which he now accepted as both inevitable and useful. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in the corner, her knitting needles clicking softly. Right then, Slack began, consulting his notes. What we need to establish is exactly where everyone was between 10 and 11 o'clock on Saturday morning. That's the window during which Mr. Bloom was killed, and his body moved to the scene behind stall 7. He turned first to Ivy Nesbit. Miss Nesbit, let's start with you. Where were you during that time? Ivy's chin lifted defensively. At my stall, naturally, serving customers. I had a wedding party consultation that lasted from about 10:20 until nearly 11. 3 ladies choosing ribbons and discussing color schemes for a June wedding. They were most particular about everything. Can anyone confirm this? The 3 ladies themselves can confirm it. Mrs. Hartley, Miss Dobson, and Mrs. Fenton. They'll remember because I gave them samples of 3 different pink ribbons, and they spent ages debating the merits of each. Ivy's tone suggested this had been a trial of patience. You can ask them yourself. Slack made a note. Thank you. We will indeed speak to them, he turned to Tom Yates. Tom? I was working on the entrance arch, sir, like I told you before, trimming the greenery and securing the garlands. Lady Bantry was watching me for part of that time, and several others walked past and nodded good morning. Lady Bantry spoke up. I can confirm Tom was visible near stall 3, up on his small ladder, for the entire period in question. He was in full view of at least a dozen people. Thank you, your ladyship. Slack looked at Peggy Marsh. Miss Marsh? I ran to the post office to send 2 account statements from Mr. Bloom. He'd asked me to get them posted first thing. I left the stall at about 10 and returned at about 10 minutes to 11. The postmistress will remember me, I'm sure. And did you see Mr. Bloom before you left? Peggy thought carefully. I saw him at about 10:25. He was organizing the wedding orders for later that morning. That was the last time I saw him alive. A shadow crossed her face, and Mrs. Prow, sitting beside her, patted her hands sympathetically. Slack turned to the sturdy grower. Mrs. Prow, what about you? I never left my stall, Inspector. I was there the whole morning, from setting up at 8 until the terrible discovery at 11:15. I served maybe a dozen customers during that time, and I can name several of them if you'd like. That won't be necessary just yet, but we may ask you for those names later. Slack consulted his notes again. Now, Mr. Keats, according to your statement, you were making your rounds, checking permits, and collecting fees. Can you tell us exactly which stalls you visited during the relevant period? Mr. Keats, looking considerably less self-assured than he had on market day, cleared his throat nervously. I made my usual circuit, Inspector. I believe I was at stall 12 at approximately 10, then moved to stall 5 where I checked Mrs. Prow's permit, and then on to stall 7 around 20 to 11. And you have records of these visits? My initials on the receipts. Yes, that's my standard practice. Everything properly documented as always. His voice had a defensive edge. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, then resumed their steady rhythm. The thing is, Mr. Keats, Slack said with deceptive mildness, your documentation shows you were at these various stalls, but it doesn't account for every minute of your time. There are gaps when you might have been anywhere. I was walking between stalls, collecting fees, doing my duty. Were you now? Slack leaned back in his chair. Young Tibby, I'd like you to tell us what you heard on Saturday morning. No need to be nervous, lad. Just tell us what you remember. Tibby sat up straighter, clearly relishing his moment. I was running messages between the stalls, sir, like I always do on market days. At about 20 minutes to 11, I was passing behind the row of stalls, taking a shortcut to deliver some change to Mrs. Prow, and I heard a sound from behind stall 7. What sort of sound? Like a crate being shoved across wood, sir. A scraping sound, heavy-like. And then just after, I heard a bucket clink, like metal touching wood. Did you see anyone? No, sir. The stalls were all closed up at the back, and I was in a hurry. I didn't think nothing of it at the time. People are always moving crates and such at the market. Slack nodded. Thank you, Tibby. That's very helpful. He turned back to Keats. At 20 minutes to 11, Mr. Keats, where were you? Keats's face had grown pale. I don't recall exactly. Moving between stalls. As I said, the sound young Tibby heard matches exactly what we'd expect if someone were moving Mr. Bloom's body into position and then placing a bucket carefully beside it. The timing also fits with Dr. Haydock's estimate of when death occurred. Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. I wonder, Inspector, if anyone saw Mr. Bloom alive after 10. Slack consulted his notes. According to all accounts, the last confirmed sighting of Mr. Bloom was at approximately 10:35 when he was observed behind his stall by a customer who'd asked for help carrying a large order. After that, no one saw him until Miss Marsh found the body. And Mr. Keats's movements during that critical period? That's what we're trying to establish. Miss Marple, Mr. Keats claims he was simply going about his rounds, but we have no witnesses who can place him anywhere specific between 10:30 and 10:40. Keats found his voice again, though it trembled slightly. This is outrageous! I've explained my movements. I have receipts with my initials proving where I was. You have receipts proving you were at certain stalls at certain times, Miss Marple corrected gently. But receipts can be time-stamped incorrectly, either accidentally or deliberately. What you don't have, Mr. Keats, is anyone who actually saw you at those stalls at the precise times you claim. Lady Bantry leaned forward. Jane, are you suggesting the receipts were falsified? Not falsified exactly, but perhaps written after the fact and assigned earlier times to create an alibi. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady clicking. It would be simple enough to initial several receipts in quick succession once the murder had been committed, making it appear that one had been moving steadily from stall to stall, when in fact there had been a gap in one's rounds. The room fell silent. Keats opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. Inspector Slack stood. Mr. Keats, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Harold Bloom. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be given in evidence. As the constables moved to escort Keats from the room, he seemed to crumple, all his officiousness draining away. He looked suddenly much older and considerably smaller than he had appeared in his council clerk persona. It was the exposure, he said quietly, almost to himself. The shame of it, my position, my reputation. He was going to destroy everything over a few pounds. A few pounds multiplied many times over, Slack said grimly. And a man's life, Mr. Keats, that's what your reputation cost. After Keats had been led away, the others filed out slowly, talking in hushed voices. Miss Marple remained seated, finishing the row on her knitting. The alibis were the key, weren't they? Lady Bantry said. Everyone else was accounted for, but Keats had that gap in his movements. Just enough time to commit murder and stage the scene. Time and opportunity and motive, Miss Marple agreed. The deadly trinity of murder. Mr. Keats had all three, despite his careful preparations to suggest otherwise. She tucked away her knitting with satisfaction. The pieces had fallen into place at last. Chapter 9. Shears in the Moss Trough. The discovery of the hidden pruner in the moss trough had provided the final piece of physical evidence, but Inspector Slack was a thorough man who believed in leaving no stone unturned. On Friday afternoon, he arranged for all the cutting implements to be laid out once, more in the evidence room at the police station, this time with Dr. Haydock present to provide expert testimony about the correlation between tools and wounds Miss Marple had been invited to observe, and she arrived with her usual quiet punctuality, accompanied by Lady Bantry, who had developed a keen interest in the forensic aspects of the case. The implements were arranged in a neat row on a cloth-covered table. Tom's long bypass hedging shears, still tagged as evidence, though their innocence was now established. Ivy Nesbitt's anvil secateurs, which had caused such confusion with her insistence that Tom had borrowed them. Mrs. Prow's general pruning shears. And finally, two small pruners. The bright, newer one that Keats had produced from his pocket on Saturday, and the darkened, water-stained one that Miss Marple had retrieved from the moss trough. Dr. Haydock stood beside the table, spectacles perched on his nose, examining each implement with scientific precision. He had brought with him detailed photographs of Harold Bloom's wound taken from multiple angles, and these were now spread beside the tools. "The wound characteristics are quite distinctive," Haydock began, addressing the small group assembled. "The injury shows a crushing compression consistent with an anvil-type blade striking against bone and soft tissue. The width of the crush pattern measures approximately 12 millimeters. He picked up the water-stained pruner from the moss trough with gloved hands. "This implement, when measured, shows an anvil width of 12 millimeters, an exact match." "And the nick?" Slack prompted. "Ah, yes, the nick." Haydock produced his magnifying glass and indicated the small imperfection in the anvil surface. "This corresponds precisely with the secondary mark, visible on both the wound and on the cut permit string. When I examined the wound under magnification, I found a small additional laceration approximately 2 millimeters long running perpendicular to the main cut. This nick created that secondary injury." He held up one of the photographs. "You can see it here if you look closely. At the time, I thought it might be from bone fragmentation, but now I understand it was a signature left by the imperfect tool." Miss Marple had been studying the two pruners with great interest. "Dr. Haydock, would you say these two implements are identical in type?" "Very nearly. Same manufacturer, same model, purchased perhaps a year or two apart based on the wear patterns. The newer one shows almost no use, while the one from the moss trough has clearly seen regular service." "Which suggests," Miss Marple observed, "that Mr. Keats acquired a replacement specifically to have an innocent tool to show investigators while hiding the actual murder weapon." Lady Bantry was examining the moss trough pruner. "But wouldn't the blood evidence on this one be washed away by the water?" "Not entirely," Dr. Haydock said. "We've conducted preliminary tests, and there are traces of human blood in the crevices of the mechanism, protected from the water by the metal housing. The full laboratory analysis will take several days, but I'm confident it will prove to be Mr. Bloom's blood." Slack nodded with satisfaction. "That seals it, then. Keats killed Bloom with his regular pruner, the one with a distinctive nick. He hid it in the moss trough, thinking the water would clean it, and no one would think to look there. Then he produced his spare pruner, brand new and unused, claiming it was the only one he owned." "A clever plan," Miss Marple said, "but one that failed to account for several factors. First, that anyone would distinguish between bypass and anvil cuts. Second, that his original pruner would leave such a distinctive signature. And third, that anyone would think to search the moss trough thoroughly." Ivy Nesbit had been summoned to clarify her earlier statement about Tom borrowing her anvil secateurs. She arrived looking considerably chastened, her earlier defensive sharpness replaced by uncomfortable embarrassment. "I'm sorry for the confusion," she said when questioned. "I truly believe Tom had used my secateurs. When I returned to my stall after serving the wedding party, I found them displaced from where I'd left them, wet from the moss trough. I simply assumed Tom must have borrowed them while I was occupied." "But you didn't actually see him take them?" Slack asked. "No, I didn't. It was just an assumption." She hesitated. "I suppose I wanted to believe it might have been Tom because it deflected attention from the fact that my own tool had been in the water. I was afraid you might think I'd been involved somehow." "Did you notice anyone else near your stall during the relevant time?" Ivy considered this carefully. "Mr. Keats came by to check my permit at some point that morning. I was busy with the wedding party, so I wasn't paying close attention. He might have had access to my tools while I was distracted." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Miss Nesbit, when you found your secateurs wet, did you examine them closely?" "Not particularly. I was annoyed about them being moved, but I simply dried them and put them back in their proper place. So you wouldn't have noticed if there had been 2 pruners in the moss trough instead of 1? Ivy's eyes widened. 2? No, I suppose I wouldn't have noticed. I was only looking for my own tool. This was illuminating. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Slack. I believe what happened is quite clear now. Mr. Keats, after killing Mr. Bloom with his distinctive pruner, needed to hide it quickly. He placed it in the moss trough, but in his haste or panic, he also displaced Miss Nesbit's anvil secateurs, which had been stored nearby. When Miss Nesbit later found her own tool wet and moved, she naturally assumed someone had borrowed it, and Tom Yates seemed the obvious culprit, given his work with the greenery. So Keats's hiding place accidentally created additional confusion, Lady Bantry said. Precisely. And it nearly worked in his favor, as it cast another layer of suspicion about. If Miss Nesbit believed Tom had borrowed her anvil tool, it might suggest Tom had used an anvil implement rather than his own bypass shears, which could muddy the waters considerably. Dr. Haydock was nodding. The moss trough was actually rather clever as a hiding place. The water would wash away surface blood. The location was communal enough that no one owned it specifically, and submerged in water and moss. A small metal tool would be nearly invisible unless someone knew to look for it. But not clever enough, Slack said with grim satisfaction. Not when Miss Marple decided to investigate thoroughly. As the meeting concluded and the various participants departed, Miss Marple remained for a moment studying the 2 pruners side by side, one bright and new, purchased to create a false narrative, one darkened and worn, bearing the evidence of murder in its metal crevices. It's remarkable, she said softly to Lady Bantry, how people believe they can purchase innocence. A new tool identical to the old, and suddenly the old tool with its guilt can be made to disappear. But objects carry their histories with them, just as people do. That nick in the anvil was created through long use, through hundreds of small cuts over months or years. One cannot simply buy a new tool and pretend the old one never existed, especially, she added, when the old one leaves its signature on everything it touches. Just so, Miss Marple agreed. Just so. Chapter 10, Market. Cut tape and the clerk with an anvil bite. The Saturday following Mr. Keats's arrest dawned bright and clear, as though the weather itself wished to distance itself from the previous week's tragedy. The Much Benham Flower Market opened as usual, though the atmosphere remained subdued, and Stall 7 stood empty, its striped awning furled, and its space marked only by the cobblestones that still bore faint stains. No amount of scrubbing had entirely removed them. Miss Marple had come to the market not to purchase flowers, but to observe, and perhaps to provide comfort through her quiet presence. She found the regular stallholders carrying on with determined normality, though their conversations were hushed, and their glances occasionally strayed toward the vacant space where Harold Bloom had conducted his business. Inspector Slack had requested that Miss Marple meet him at the market at 11 o'clock, and she found him standing near the entrance arch, which Tom Yates had decorated with fresh garlands, as though laying a wreath for the week's sorrows. Miss Marple? Slack greeted her with something approaching warmth. I wanted you to hear the final pieces before they become public record, Keats confessed last night. Did he? Indeed, completely. Once we showed him the pruner from the moss trough and explained how the blood traces would prove his guilt regardless, he saw no point in continuing the pretense. Slack consulted his notebook. Shall I tell you how it happened, as Keats described it? Please do, Inspector. Lady Bantry had joined them, along with Dr. Haydock, who had expressed a professional interest in hearing the resolution of the case. They formed a small circle near Mrs. Prowse's stall, speaking in tones that would not carry to the other stallholders. According to Keats, Slack began, Harold Bloom confronted him shortly after 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, before the market properly opened. Bloom had been keeping careful records of his payments and had discovered the discrepancies between what he paid and what Keats recorded in the official ledger. He accused Keats of systematic theft and threatened to expose him to both the council and the local newspaper. "The threat of public shame," Miss Marple murmured. For a man of Mr. Keats's temperament, that would be unendurable. Exactly what Keats said himself. He claimed he didn't plan to kill Bloom, that it happened in a moment of panic. They were arguing behind stall 7, where Bloom had gone to fetch some crates. Keats followed him, still trying to convince Bloom to keep quiet, perhaps suggesting he'd return the money or make amends. But Bloom was adamant. He said the matter would be in the newspapers by Monday. And then? Lady Bantry prompted. Keats says he reacted without thinking. He had his pruner in his hand, the one he uses for trimming permit tags, and he struck at Bloom's neck. One heavy blow catching the carotid artery. Bloom collapsed almost immediately, and Keats realized what he'd done. Dr. Haydock shook his head gravely. Death would have come quickly with that wound, within a minute or two at most. Keats panicked at first, Slack continued, but then his mind started working. He knew Tom Yates's long hedging shears were propped against the back of Bloom's stall. He knew, if he could make it look like Tom had committed the murder, suspicion would point away from himself. So he began staging the scene. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. The blood on Tom's shears transferred from his own pruner blade. He wiped Bloom's blood onto Tom's shears and placed them beside the body. Then he moved Bloom's body slightly, creating that drag mark you noticed, Miss Marple, to make space for his tableau. He slid a crate across the planking to create the appearance of a struggle. "And the bucket," Lady Bantry said, "the bucket that never spilled." Keats fetched it from near another stall and carried it carefully to the scene, tucking it against his body to avoid sloshing water. He wanted it to look as though Bloom had been standing by the bucket when attacked, that there had been a violent encounter. But he was too careful with it, and the bucket remained perfectly upright, the water undisturbed. "The left-handed knot on the awning," Miss Marple added. "That was another mistake," Slack nodded. "Keats is left-handed, though he does most tasks with either hand. In his haste to retie the awning guy and suggest a struggle, he used his dominant hand and created a knot quite different from Tom's habitual right-handed bowline." "What about the permit string?" Dr. Haydock asked. "Why cut that?" "Ah, that's where Keats's cleverness nearly worked against him," Slack said. He'd already used his pruner to kill Bloom, and in doing so, he'd necessarily touched various surfaces and objects in the area. He was afraid the distinctive nick in his pruner might have left marks that could be traced back to him. So he deliberately cut the permit string openly and in full view, establishing an innocent reason for his pruner to have been used near Bloom's stall. Miss Marple nodded slowly, creating a plausible explanation for any suspicious cuts that might be discovered. If someone noticed the nick mark on the permit string, he could say quite truthfully that he'd trimmed it that morning precisely. And then he hid his actual pruner in the moss, Truff displacing Ivy Nesbit's secateurs in the process, and produced his spare pruner as the only tool he claimed to own. "The green tape on his cuff and fingers," Lady Bantry said. "That came from handling the permits." "Yes, though more extensively than normal. He'd handled Bloom's permit during the staging, and he'd retied the awning with florist tape that he found at the scene, trying to make everything look disturbed and hasty. The tape residue transferred to his jacket and hands. Slack's expression grew grim. He was meticulous about some details and careless about others. The mark of an amateur criminal, if you will. Miss Marple gazed around the market square, at the bright awnings and buckets of flowers, at the ordinary commerce of a Saturday morning continuing despite the shadow of murder that had fallen across it. "What strikes me most," she said quietly, "is the terrible disproportion of it all. Mr. Keats had been stealing, certainly, but those crimes might have resulted in dismissal and modest penalties at worst. By choosing murder, he transformed himself from a petty thief into something far darker. And all of it, every calculated step, was aimed at avoiding the exposure and shame of his original wrongdoing. Pride and fear, Dr. Haydock observed. Deadly combination indeed. And the irony is that his very attempts to be clever, to stage the scene so carefully, left more evidence than if he had simply fled after striking the blow. The drag marks, the pristine bucket, the wrong knot, the cuts that told their story, all the small green stickiness he left behind on his clothing. Each element of his staging became a thread leading back to him. Inspector Slack closed his notebook. "I wanted to thank you properly, Miss Marple. Without your observations about the cuts and the tools, we might well have charged Tom Yates. The evidence against him looked compelling at first glance." "Evidence often does look compelling at first glance, Inspector. That's rather the nature of staged evidence. It's designed to compel. But surfaces can be deceptive, and it's the small inconsistencies beneath the surface that reveal the truth." As they prepared to part ways, Lady Bantry looked across at the busy market stalls, at Mrs. Prow arranging her roses, at Ivy Nesbit serving a customer, at Tom Yates checking the garlands he'd hung with such care. Flowers do seem to see everything, don't they, Jane? Miss Marple smiled gently, tucking her handbag under her arm. "They do, my dear. They witness all our follies and tragedies without judgment. But flowers don't tell what they've seen. One must look at the cuts, at the small marks people leave behind, at the signatures written in metal and tape and water stains. One must observe not just what is presented, but what is revealed in spite of all attempts to conceal it." She glanced once more at the empty space where stall 7 had stood. Mr. Keats thought he could purchase innocence with a new pruner and stage guilt with bloodied shears. But tools carry their histories, Inspector, just as people do. That small nick in the anvil told a story he couldn't erase, no matter how carefully he planned. "Tools have signatures," Slack said, repeating her earlier words. "They do indeed. And so do people, in their habits and choices and small mistakes. One simply needs to know how to read them." As Miss Marple walked slowly home through the spring sunshine, she reflected on the case and its resolution. Another puzzle solved. Another murderer brought to justice. Another innocent man saved from wrongful accusation. The market would recover. Time would pass. And eventually, even the shadow of murder would fade from the cobblestones of Much Benham. But the lessons remained. Pride and fear. Calculation and panic. The terrible disproportion between crime and consequence. And above all, the small, persistent truth that surfaces could deceive, but details, properly observed, would always tell their tale.